Today we are talking about Scrum versus Kanban, and we are going to figure out which one is best, right, Duncan?
It's a fight to the death.
There can be only one.
%80 of agile projects are Scrum, Kanban, or some kind of hybrid. So it'd be quite interesting to compare the two approaches to work out which one's best. Which do we prefer?
And people very definitely fall into one camp or the other. There's very much a Kanban team and there's very much Team Scrum.
Yeah, it's probably worth declaring that we're both naturally Team Scrum. So we'll try not to be too biased.
Transparency, full transparency. So let's start off with the foundations. What is Scrum? How would you describe it?
We're going to be talking about Scrum as defined by the Scrum Guide, as written by Ken and Jeff, and the Kanban method, because there are obviously various flavors of Kanban, if you like. So the origins of Scrum and Kanban are pretty similar. Scrum comes from the new product development game, which was published in the Harvard Business Review and was codified around 95, whereas Kanban comes from the Toyota production system, and the Kanban method was codified in 2007.
I did not know that. Scrum fact.
Scrum and Kanban fact. Okay, so we're both familiar with Scrum. Scrum is a lightweight framework for complex adaptive product development. What about Kanban?
Kanban allows teams to define their workflow and then to actively manage items in that workflow and look for opportunities to improve.
Scrum is a simple framework. We've got 3 roles, 5 events, and 3 artifacts. And crucially, you need to put these in place if you want to do Scrum. You need to have a Scrum Master and a product owner and a development team, else you're not doing Scrum. And similarly, you need to follow through with the events and have the artifacts. With Scrum, you need to put in place your sprints, your iterations, and they can be a week, 2 weeks, or maybe a month, but that's how you deliver your work. What's the equivalent of a sprint in Kanban?
In Kanban, the work continuously flows across the Kanban board. Kanban doesn't really iterate. The equivalent of a sprint in a Kanban would be getting a piece of work from start to finish. It doesn't really have an equivalent concept.
And this is probably where the friction between Kanban teams and Scrum team comes about, because Kanban teams think they work in a more natural way, where they just keep on working, and Scrum teams are used to working in sprints. And Kanban teams kind of see this as quite artificial. So Scrum teams have a Scrum Master, a product owner, and a development team. What about Kanban teams?
Kanban advocates the roles that already exist within the organization. Kanban doesn't tend to impose fixed roles within the team. It's more engaging with the way the team currently work so that they can visualize how that work gets done.
Yeah, so the Kanban principles, and again, we're taking this from the Kanban method, are that you start with what you know. You agree to make change, and you initially respect the roles which are in place, and you're encouraging leadership at all levels. So rather than having these prescribed roles, which Scrum has, Kanban really, I guess, evolves from whatever you're starting out with.
Which again are two similarities between the two approaches. Scrum encourages a flat hierarchy structure by having all roles being of equal importance. And Kanban encourages leadership at all levels. So those principles are more or less the same between the two.
Now with Scrum, we have these artifacts. We have our product backlog, our sprint backlog, and the increment. And we're trying to deliver a new done increment every sprint. Now Kanban, probably the closest to that is the Kanban Practices. And this is that we visualize our workflow. We limit work in progress. We manage flow. We make whatever policies we've got explicit, and we implement feedback loops, and we agree to improve continuously, collaboratively. So this sounds like the aim is very similar, but there's a lot less structure with Kanban.
I think so. The aim is transparency with both of them.
Scrum also seems to be focused on maybe velocity, even though velocity isn't really mentioned in the Scrum guide. Scrum teams are always talking about their velocity, whereas Kanban's talking about work in progress. Why do we like to limit work in progress? What are WIP limits?
So typically on a Kanban board, we're going to try and limit the amount of stuff that's in any one column due to the cost of the overhead of multitasking and all of that kind of stuff. Kanban is very explicit about work in progress limits. Each column on the board will have a defined work in progress limit. Because it's a pull system, we physically can't put any more work items into a column that's already full. We only pull new items into that column when we've got capacity. So there's one difference between the two, that Kanban is very prescriptive about work in progress because it's focused on the flow.
The more that the team is focused on a smaller set of work, the faster that work will get through the pipe. Whereas Scrum doesn't really focus on that speed through the pipe at all.
You're totally right. Kanban is all about measuring the speed of work items, the work item age, the throughput of the team, measuring that and increasing that speed. Whereas with Scrum, interestingly, the goal isn't to increase velocity.
So I guess the subtle thing is that by having that work in progress limit, you then see where your bottlenecks are. You then see where work is stacking up. And that then motivates the team to fix those bottlenecks. So it's kind of the visualization of the WIP limits, which drives that continuous improvement, which is one of those fundamental Kanban practices.
I think that's absolutely right. And interestingly, in Scrum, we do the same thing. We have our retrospective where we look at what our problems are and we have an explicit event to attempt to find ways to resolve them.
Now, interestingly, the one thing which Kanban prescribes must happen is visualizing your workflow. In a Kanban approach, you have to visualize what your workflow is. Now, although most Scrum teams do visualize their workflow, that's not prescribed as part of Scrum, but most teams just actually end up doing that as a complementary practice.
I think a great Scrum team and a great Kanban team will end up doing more or less the same things.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so what are the benefits of Scrum? What are the benefits of Kanban? It feels like Kanban has a lot more flexibility. It's got to be easier to kick off because all you need to do is establish your process, visualize your process, and then you can start doing Kanban. I think it would be fair to say that Scrum is focused on how you are realizing a vision for a product. So it's all really based around business goals and making distinct steps towards business goals. Whereas Kanban is maybe a bit more focused on the number of widgets that you're sort of pushing through this pipe. Maybe. We've talked a little bit about Scrum, we talked a little bit about Kanban, but when would we naturally use each one? So Scrum seems like a good fit for software development.
Scrum seems like a great fit when we've got complex problems to solve and we've got a stable team that we're going to use to solve those problems, I think.
And Kanban maybe is more generic. If we have any kind of work that we're doing and we need to work out how we can get more work done, how we can push more through that pipe, how can we improve our processes. It doesn't really matter whether you're making coffee or muffins or developing software. Kanban can be applied to all of those processes.
How about if we've got a process that we can't predict, like the work comes in and we're not able to plan that work. We simply have to react to it. Like a project, you can probably plan the work, but something like a ticketing system would be the classic example where we can't plan the work. We simply have to react to it as and when it comes in and prioritize on the fly. Kanban's going to be a great fit for that. Whereas that kind of structure would be very disruptive in Scrum. If we spent time, we spent money doing our planning, and then we have to throw that out the window as soon as new work comes in, that's going to be a waste. And that's the opposite of what we're trying to do with both of these things.
Absolutely. So Scrum is more suited to work that you can plan at least a week or two in advance. Which one's best? I'm still not sure.
Good question, and a trick question, I think. How about they're both best? They work together, they work hand in hand. We can think of Kanban as an overlay on top of Scrum. We can take the core Scrum framework. We can then focus on maximizing our throughput as well, knowing that we're doing the right stuff. And we can focus on measuring our throughput too. More data is better. So along with our velocity that we may or may not want to use in Scrum, we can look at our throughput, we can look at our cycle time, and all of these Kanban metrics to give us even more information to inspect and adapt upon. We can become even more empirical.
I think that Kanban teams could benefit from Scrum's focus on inspecting and adapting our progress towards business goals. In other words, are we doing the right thing? And I think Scrum teams could benefit from Kanban's focus on, can we get more work done in a continuous way?
And there doesn't seem to be any reason not to use that approach. Kanban doesn't take anything away from Scrum. Scrum doesn't take anything away from Kanban.
Yep, so instead of talking about Scrum versus Kanban, we should be talking about Scrum plus Kanban.
Agreed. Scrum chat.
Scrum chat.